we'll let Louise start, and then the way we're going to do this, Louise is going to give us a short introduction on the census, and then we'll have 4 speakers who are going to discuss a bit more in detail what happened on their islands. After each speaker, we'll try to have a few questions. I think you should be able to raise your hand at the bottom of your screen. There's a raise hand. If you have a question, if you want to speak, or you can type it in the chat and we'll monitor the chat as well. And feel free to ask questions in English, Spanish, French, maybe not Dutch because not many people speak Dutch. But all right, go ahead, Louise.
Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. So as Owen said, welcome to the first of our webinars that will update on the Caribbean-wide regional seabird census. I'm Louise Soanes, and I've been helping to coordinate the census over about the last year. And I'm just going to provide a bit of background to the census before then introducing the guest speakers. Oh, not moving. My slides aren't moving. What's happening here? You were moving. Let me stop and start again.
Are you using the Google Doc slides?
See from them. Okay. Move now. Okay. So as most of us are aware, the Caribbean is one of the most important regions in the world for seabirds. However, the information that Birds Caribbean, along with you and the local partners, have gathered over the last 20 or so years has indicated there's been quite significant declines in many colonies, and some populations are just now remnant of what they once were. The negative impacts of invasive species, coastal development, and climate change on seabirds are well documented nationally, regionally, and globally. So we are seeing those impacts, but not all hope is lost. There have been many conservation successes in the region that have helped the region's seabird populations to recover. But in order to plan, prioritize, and gain funding for these kind of recovery programs, there is a need to establish population baselines, and long-term monitoring is really essential. So that leads us to the reason for this webinar, the Caribbean Seabird Census. And how did this initiative begin? Well, in 2021, during the Birds Caribbean Seabird Fests, we recognized collectively that in order to effectively protect seabirds, we urgently need to improve our knowledge on population sizes and their distribution throughout the Caribbean. And while we recognize that many countries do conduct their own seabird monitoring programs, and there have been several publications that have collated historic data, such as Bradley and Norton's 2009 inventory of Caribbean seabirds, and there have been some sub-regional initiatives, such as EPIC's surveys of the Lesser Antilles. We all recognize that we were well overdue a regional seabird census program. So that led in 2022 to the launch of the Caribbean Seabird Census, which was launched in partnership between Birds Caribbean and EPIC, with the aim of collecting and collating seabird breeding data from across the region between 2023 and 2024. Some people have collected the data a bit earlier, and some people are still collecting the data. So we recognize it's a longer, a few year process, perhaps. So this is just our first update on the census so far. We're pleased to update that so far more than 60 collaborators representing 27 countries and territories in the wider Caribbean region have committed to supporting this initiative. Thanks to all of you who have already submitted data and to those who are still collecting data. We appreciate the efforts you've made so far, and we're happy to receive your data whenever it's ready or help you submit it. So for this map just highlights where we have where data is being collected or has been collected, and some of the gaps that we're seeing emerging that we hope to address in the coming year. So from the ABC Islands in the south to Bermuda in the north, the local partners have been collecting seabird data using a range of methods, from counting birds from a boat, directly counting nests, to conducting drone and acoustic surveys. So it's a lot of different methods and different people involved in this. And as we just finished the first year of the survey, really, so we have been collecting data, but as the data is still coming in and we know people are still surveying, we haven't really started to analyze the data as a whole as yet. As Ivan said, we'll be doing that later in the summer. We'll make a start on that. But we thought early in 2024, it'd be good to update on what has been going on, to show you some of the surveys that have taken place and the results that we are getting in, and to show how this data is really important for informing conservation actions, which we'll hear about now in the next few presentations by Paige, Natalie and Margot, Rhiannon and Farah. So that's all from me from now, and I'll introduce Paige to start her presentation. Paige Byerly. I'll stop sharing. Oh, any questions so far on that? I'll let you start sharing, Paige.
All right, great. Thanks, Louise. Thanks everybody for having me and for the Seabird Working Group for organizing this. This is a really awesome initiative. Excited to be presenting some results. So what I'm really presenting today is a bit of an overview of a paper that we've just had out in 2023 in the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology. So to make a plug for the journal, if you're interested in these results, you can check out the further paper. So I'm here to talk about some trends in the US and British Virgin Islands. And this was data collected and compiled with my co-authors, Susan, Daniel, Judy, and Paul. So we're here today to talk about the importance of these long-term monitoring of colonial seabirds, and we know that there's been a real dearth of this data in the Caribbean. And the efforts organized by the working group and the survey are so wonderful because the consistency of methods across years is extremely important for establishing trends. So seabirds move around a lot, they don't breed every year. There's a lot of factors that can make just even one annual snapshot survey really, really important, but to get trends, we need longer surveys over time and with really consistent methodology. But we know that the Caribbean is really challenging to work with, and these data are not always available. So it's very expensive to do these surveys. These birds breed across really vast areas. All of the many, many reasons they breed across the year. Their breeding is not always synchronous. And so our paper from 2023 kind of makes the plug that even though we don't always have data with this consistent, great methodology that the Seabird survey has provided for us, we should still use whatever we have available to look at updating population statuses and evaluating trends, because these data are really, really important for conservation, even when they may not be as rigorous as data that we collect now with these sort of newer standards and even newer technologies. And so today I'm going to be talking about the Virgin Islands. This is two territories. So we have the US Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands, and it's an archipelago of over 60 small islands and keys. So a ton of small islands. Historically, there were 15 to 17 breeding seabird species in this region, so the data are a little spotty. And this is a region of really high tourism, especially boat tourism. So this is a big sailing region, and a lot of the tourism is centered on being on or in the water, which is great. So these are two separate territories, and the resources are managed separately between them. So the US and British Virgin Islands, like I said. And for seabird management, that can be a challenge because these territories are extremely close together. So in this photo here, I am standing on Congo Key in the US Virgin Islands, and I am looking out on the British Virgin Islands. So not the little rocky Carval Rock in the immediate foreground, but everything behind it is the British Virgin Islands. These territories are really close together, and we know that seabirds don't recognize boundaries. So this can make seabird management kind of challenging in this region. Also challenging is the mosaic of protection across seabird breeding islands. So there is an enormous variation in protection in the US Virgin Islands. The majority of islands are protected and managed by the US Virgin Islands Division of Fish and Wildlife through the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. And some of these islands are closed to visitors during the breeding season or permanently. There's some US federal refuge islands. And a lot of these islands, however, are privately owned. And in the British Virgin Islands, there's also a pretty wide variation between national parks and private islands. And this can also make sort of both standardizing counts and standardizing management across islands extremely challenging. So there's a lot of reasons in the Virgin Islands why we might not have a lot of historical survey data. So as across the Caribbean, a lot of species have multiple breeding seasons per year and asynchronous breeding. So they can't all be terns, which have a pretty tight May through June schedule, minus some weirdos like the city terns. Pelicans, the boobies might breed all year round or have peak breeding in the winter. So we can't just do one survey a year for all the birds in a region. In the VI, some colony sites can be really hazardous to access. So we don't have these flat sandy keys that are seen in some parts of the Caribbean a little bit further north. These are volcanic keys, so they're pretty rocky. And up until about April, the oceans can be pretty big. And so it can be really difficult to access some of these colony sites. And then some species, mainly looking at you, roseate terns, actually switch colony sites yearly. So we can't just return to the same island every year to look for them. We need to look across the entire territory to get an accurate assessment of breeding counts. And so because of all these reasons, the most recent, as of when this paper was published or when we started working on this project, published population estimates weren't current for most seabird species in the region. And we don't have temporal data for most of the species. And so this can make conservation planning and management really challenging. And so we had kind of an overall goal of compiling published population abundance estimates from 2000 on. 2000 is probably when the best records start for these two territories. And we picked 7 focal colonial seabird species. So we compiled historical data and then conducted more recent counts. And then we compared these 2 points to evaluate qualitative population changes in the VI. So the big distinction here is that when we are comparing data of different types of surveys, as I'm going to be kind of discussing, it's really hard to make any kind of quantitative analyses or good statistical analyses about changes in population trends. But we can still look at the overall pattern of the data and get an idea of what's happening in our regions, and that's really important. So we divided our species between resident and migratory. And for resident species, we have brown pelicans, brown boobies, red-footed boobies, and masked boobies. So these are just species that stay on the island year-round, and a lot of them have multiple breeding seasons through the year and breed during the winter. And then for migratory species, these guys only have one breeding season, and they pretty much breed in May and June. They're mostly winding down in July by the time we hit hurricane season in August. And this is the roseate tern, and then the sandwich and royal tern, which breed in mixed colonies. These aren't the only species in this area, obviously, but these are the ones that we chose to focus on as having the most amount of historical data available. So we compiled data from 8 published records from 2000 to 2020. Most of these are books, so not necessarily published papers. There's some pretty great literature out there that's available for across the Caribbean. And as I said, these data were collected by a mix of survey types. So some were by direct count, so going into colonies and counting nests, and some were boat-based estimates. Some were just ranges. Some were really based on sort of a general idea of how many birds were in the area. And a lot of these are just kind of what we would think of as best knowledge estimates. So we can kind of think of these historical data as representing best expert knowledge of seabird populations from these time periods. And these were all compiled by some really great researchers. So we have a pretty good idea of the rigor, which is pretty good. And then for contemporary species, I'm not going to go through our methods too much because I don't have too much time. It's all in that paper. For the resident species, so the boobies and the pelicans, we had 3-period surveys between November and August from 2016 to 2018. And that's to account for the multiple breeding seasons within this period. And we surveyed 6 known islands for boobies and 4 for brown pelicans. And population estimates are presented as nest counts, and these were primarily made by foot counts of nests, although brown pelicans in the VI nest in trees, and these were counted by boats. And for migratory species, for 2016 and 2018, we have the sandwich and royal terns, and these were counted by entering colonies and counting all the eggs or counting all the nests. We actually have data from roseate terns from 1993 to 2019. This is really the only species in the region that was consistently surveyed. Roseate terns, as I said, ship colony sites yearly, and so counting roseate terns means going and finding them, and this is all in early spring. So as I said, these aren't flat islands. These are very rocky volcanic islands. And so the surveys consist of landing a boat on the off the shore of the island. We can't land a boat on any of the islands, swimming out to the islands with all of our gear, entering colonies and counting eggs and chicks, many of which are pretty hidden. And this is just a look at the primary islands that we survey. And there are a few more than this, but these are kind of the historical known and priority nesting sites. And I wanted to show this because you can get a good idea of the coverage. So particularly for the roseate tern counts, when we're looking for roseate terns, we visit each of these islands. And so we really have an amazing coverage of seabirds in this region. So even though there are over 60 little islands, we do have a pretty good idea of who is where, which is pretty amazing, I think, for such a massive region. And I just want to highlight that in 2017, we had the horrible hurricanes, Irma and Maria. And so this is the island of US Van Dyke in the British Virgin Islands. And this is just July. And in September, I'm sure everyone remembers the devastation of these hurricanes. And because we were conducting surveys in 2017 and 2018, we had kind of a unique opportunity to see how the immediate effects of these hurricanes influence seabirds, since, as we can see, the terrain got extremely destroyed. We really only have counts for most resident and migratory species for the USVI. So we know there are no longer masked and red-footed boobies in the BVI, and brown pelican and brown booby counts have not been conducted very consistently in this region, but we do know these species are in heavy decline. Unfortunately, we don't have contemporary numbers to show this. Royal terns were extirpated from the BVI, and sandwich terns are nesting only in Anegada in the BVI, and we just weren't able to get out there and count. So for BVI, we really only have roseate terns. So this is just a look at our data. And again, looking at the historical data, so 2000 and 2009, these two data points, we can see a pretty big range of data points where we have maybe 500, maybe 1,000 brown boobies. So again, this is representing best expert knowledge. But we can still compare this to the more modern counts, again, from 2016 through 2018, and also for the resident species for 2013. We did in-person counts on the islands, and so we have more rigorous data, and these data are really showing us that even though we can't really say how much the species have declined or do any statistics, we can see evidence for some clear declines for the resident species. Emma raised your hand. I don't really know how to do that, so I'll just wait till I'm done. Sorry. If I touch everything, my computer will explode. Oh, it's too late. Okay. So then we look really quickly at results for our migratory species. Again, we have a lot of variation in historical data, so maybe 228, maybe 1,300 sandwich terns, a pretty big variation, highlighting how difficult it is to count these guys. But we can still see that there is somewhat of a decline for royal terns and maybe a little one for sandwich terns, although it's very difficult to say. So for 2023, the U.S. Virgin Islands Division of Fish and Wildlife began these seabird surveys for the regional effort, which is great. And so they were able to share some data with us for the royal and sandwich terns, and also for roseate terns. I believe they're still collecting data for other species. And so we were able to have a really nice contemporary look at 2023. So we can see that sandwich terns look pretty consistent, maybe a dip in royals. These are the kind of great things we can get from these data surveys. Quickly looking at roseate terns, as I said, we have data from 1993 to 2018, and we can really see a decline in both colonies, both territories. I just want to highlight too that you can see the magnitude of variation for each year. So roseate terns don't breed every year. And they also, as I said, move colony sites, making them difficult to count. So this really highlights the importance of these long-term counts, that we can really get an idea of trends, because if we go from year to year, we might not be seeing an accurate reflection of the population status. And so we have roseate counts from 2016 to 2023. Again, USVI DFW was able to connect counts this year, and actually going back to 2019 for roseate terns. So there's really consistent data for this species. And so we can start to maybe see evidence of a decline, although this is a species with a lot of variation, so it's a little difficult to say. And again, just the value of these long-term trends. So overall, we do see declining trends for all the species observed in this region, and we see higher declining trends for residents. So brown pelicans and brown boobies are, I again won't do statistics, but we'll say they're at the very low range of earliest 20th century estimates. We know that red-footed boobies are extirpated, and this wasn't recorded in the territory or published until our paper came out, even though we know that they have not been breeding in the territory since early 2000s. So just the data are not always up to date in these published accounts. And mass booby is really close to extirpation in this region. We didn't see any changes to colony site use. So the islands that were historically used for breeding are still used. So we didn't see a huge loss of any one colony. This is a general decline across the whole area. And we kind of want to make a plug in this paper that roseate terns are a good long-term indicator species for the marine environment in the VI. So they're one of the only species in the territory that has a trend going back so long. And so this really shows a clear decline in the marine environment, or I believe these can be linked. On positive end, we didn't see any immediate effects of the 2017 hurricanes. So we had no major loss of birds the next year, and that suggests that probably the terns were all gone for the hurricanes and that the resident birds have some coping mechanisms to deal with this. So our recommendations from this paper are, of course, that we need more standardized breeding seabird surveys. That's why we're all here. So there isn't currently a real program established in the British Virgin Islands. Susan Zaleski, who we all know, collects data when she can, but this isn't really through sort of an official mechanism yet. So some seabird surveys are really needed in that region. And we are really looking forward to winter breeding resident counts from the USVI to see how the boobies and pelicans are doing. And the real research need in the region is just why are these seabirds declining? Because we see these declines across such disparate groups. It really doesn't tie to sort of any one thing. So looking at prey availability, habitat degradation, sea surface temperature is rising. That arrow is supposed to be with sea surface temperature, not floating around, but that's fine. Nest survival and productivity. As across the Caribbean, we just don't really have a huge handle on why this is happening, and we really need to know why our birds are leaving. So these data were collected with an enormous amount of people. I can't thank them all, but I want to thank Birds Caribbean for inviting me and for publishing our work in the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology. And thanks to the Division of Fish and Wildlife for providing these 2023 data. It was really helpful to see. So I think I can take questions now. I'm not sure how much time I have left, Louise. I wasn't timing.
Yeah, we probably need to move on quite soon, but there was one question from Emma Lewis about why have several species been extirpated from the BVI? Is there any?
That's a really good question. We do believe that the BVI has lower protection on the islands and higher use of many of the islands. In the USVI, as I said, a lot of them are closed to public visits in the summer, and we never saw people on any of these closed breeding islands, whereas the BVI is open to people to visit throughout the breeding season. And we know that the roseate terns have stopped breeding there as well as many of these other species.
Maybe if anyone else has any other questions, they could type them in as they think of them. If we move on now to a talk on St. Martin, Margot and Natalia. Thank you, Paige. That was great.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Natalia Collier with Environmental Protection in the Caribbean. I'm going to be presenting today on our work we've done on pelicans on St. Martin. And the first part of this is sort of the more, going too far forward, is the first part of this is more the historical work that we did, and then moving more into the intensive work that was the more intensive studies that were done this year on St. Martin. So, and I'm going to be presenting with Margot Mesnard, who was the project coordinator for this pelican project we did this year, or sorry, last year. It's now 2024. So as you all are probably familiar with the pelican, they're pretty conspicuous. They're large birds with substantial wingspans. They can weigh quite a bit, like up to 8 pounds, 3.5 kilos. And now there's 5 species of pelicans in the world. In St. Martin, we just have the Caribbean brown pelican. And they are non-migratory, but they have a really large range. And we see significant changes in their population during the breeding season. And it's not clear what that's from. It could be due to changes in the food resource. It could be due to changes in the habitat where they're nesting, maybe disturbance. So there's definitely a lot, as Paige mentioned, a lot of things that need to be determined still. And we have 2 nesting sites for pelicans on the island. The first is Fort Amsterdam, which was the focal point for research done in 2022, 2023. And this is a recognized regionally important bird area because of the pelican nesting there. And then we have Pelican Rock, which, Fort Amsterdam is a protected site. It's a zoned historical zone because of the fort there. So that is actually the only terrestrial protected site on Dutch St. Martin. And fortunately, the pelicans chose to nest there. They also used to nest on Pelican Rock, which is part of the Man of War Shoals Marine Park offshore from St. Martin. And this is also an important bird area because of the pelicans nesting there. It's regionally important. But unfortunately, as we'll see in the next slides, we also have Molly Bidet. And we haven't had pelicans nesting here, but it is an important roost site. So Pelican Rock, we started surveying there in 2001, and surveys finished in 2009. And then Nature Foundation has been doing periodic surveys since then, but they haven't included Pelican Rock, as far as I know. And you can see that there's pretty, go back. You can see there's pretty consistent nesting there throughout the period. I mean, it definitely fluctuated. But what we found is that Margot and I did a survey this past year, and there were no pelicans nesting there. And the gentleman who took us out said that anecdotally, there's not been any pelicans nesting there since Hurricane Irma, which Paige mentioned was really destructive. And it's possible the pelicans there may have just moved to Fort Amsterdam. Maybe it was less impacted, like the habitat was more intact. But it's unfortunate because this is an offshore island that is less susceptible to introduced mammal predation. I mean, Fort Amsterdam has dogs and cats and mongoose and rats. And so we would prefer to see them nesting out there, as at least you have a, more diverse nesting sites for this population. Okay, next slide. And so as I mentioned, we stopped doing surveys in 2010. And so Nature Foundation of St. Martin has been doing surveys, I think, monthly. And so this is data from their surveys showing that precipitous drop in 2018, which was right after Irma. And then it's come back again, but not as high as it was during the first surveys. And historically, back when we started doing nest counts back in 2001, we were seeing, I think, up to 80 breeding pairs. And we haven't seen numbers that high since then. So the indication would be that the population is in decline, but they are rather have a more eruptive population style in that you'll see, like big swings in the population. So we also have what seems to be an unsustainable level of nest productivity, which Margot will talk about as well. And so given this historical background, I want to then have Margot explain more about what's happened in the last couple years with the Pelican Project.
Hi, thank you, Natalia. I'll be talking about our Pelican Project, which was an in-depth study monitoring of the colony at Fort Amsterdam. So for 6 months, from November to April, we would go out there twice a week in several locations, and overall spend maybe 3 hours really counting nests, chicks, adults, juveniles, counting everything. And because we were doing it twice a week very consistently, we don't really think we were double counting. Of course, pelicans move around a lot. They go from the pond back to the colony, but it is the main colony. So we chose those dates because we thought that November was the peak of nesting season, but it's also interesting to look at the entire year. So this is the data for 6 months. So November is actually not the month with the most individuals. It was more in April. So we had to compare this data. So this is the exact count that we did. Well, this is the average per month in the first column. Average is we have around 40 individuals seen flying or at their nest during each count. It was an interesting number for awareness purpose to tell people that basically we have 40 pelicans at the main colony. There might be pelicans on the French side of the island. We compared data with the French nature reserve. But on the Dutch side, that's the numbers we have. So then comparing with the rest of the year, this is from Nature Foundation data, they identified that the max pelican count for the entire year was around 60 pelicans. So also important for awareness purposes. We took photographs because we had a lot of time and we were making sure we're not disturbing them. And we took those amazing photos of breeding pairs, the brown neck in breeding season. And so the peak of nesting activity seems to be March and July from the combined data of our 6-month study and Nature Foundation study. And then, so because it was not so many pelicans, we could really check every nest consistently and carefully and see the eggs and then the hatchling and fledging. So it was a very interesting process. Out of those 3 chicks, they're the same size here, but the week after we noticed one was significantly smaller, and then it was taking its own feathers by itself, and then it was not in the nest anymore. So chick survival is also an issue. Like it's we have to be careful, and it's a very crucial period in terms of managing the area so they're not disturbed. This was a short video, but I don't think it will be playing, of feeding time captured by our team. So it's important to protect their area, especially the trees and activity in the water as well. We'll get to it. We put a camera trap as well to check what's going on in the colony. And we can see here there's maybe a dozen pelican, but you have to look closely. So it's really important. They really stay on the cliffs, and the nests are high up in the trees. So this habitat is super important to keep this way. Risk to habitats that we actually saw over those 6 months are pollution and debris by hurricane. We had a cleanup event and we removed a whole lot of things from the bush. Water quality can be an issue. So in those bottles is a sample of the pond water. We sampled both the ocean water and the pond water to check possible contaminants We did not find heavy metals, but we found that most levels were not up to standards. So access to the pond as an ecological corridor is also very important because we saw pelican flying back and forth all day long. And maybe sargassum can be an issue with the hydrogen sulfide that it emits. Maybe sargassum is good at first because it brings a lot of marine life, but when it decomposes, we're not sure. What we saw, the biggest issue in St. Martin, because it's a very, very small island, and there's an actual recreational site right by the pelican colony. So boats come very, very close to the cliffs. We're talking about 12 boats a day with 12 people as well. And it clearly disturbs pelican because people are too close to the cliffs and the nest. And there's a newer attraction that just opened last month with an underwater sculpture, which is really great, but it's really close to the pelican site. And what we saw in terms of predation, iguanas were a major issue. Iguanas would go into the nests, and iguanas were too numerous to count. We could not count them. There's a dog on the picture, a white dog. You have to spot him. And we found a rat from our camera trap at night. So predation might be an issue. And yes, the issue of climate change and food source. If fish stocks are not available the same way, they might travel. So yeah, we were happy to run this project funded by the SPORAC, and we want everyone to protect pelicans. We did a lot of awareness going into schools and doing events. So thank you.
Thank you, Margot and Natalia. That was really interesting. And as Evan shared in the chat, that you have got a report published about the monitoring methods and your results. So there's a link to that in the chat if people would want to read more about it. Or maybe if you think of any more questions, just put them in the chat and Natalia and Margot can answer them as we go along or at the end if we get time. Oh, and Emma has a question now, I think, while Rhiannon gets ready. Or was that from before? Maybe that's from before. Okay, so next introducing Rhiannon Austin to talk about her work in the Turks and Caicos. Oh, Emma does have a question. It's, are the iguanas native species? So they're the green iguana. So they're a non-native species. I'll answer for you, Margot, but you could add more if you want.
No, correct. It's the invasive iguana type. And we haven't seen an iguana get to an egg, but they do disturb the pelicans because they go into the nest. Well, they were really into the nest. So.
Thanks.
Am I up, Louise?
Yeah, you're ready to go, Rhiannon?
Okay, 1 second. Can you see my slides, everyone?
You can see your, yeah, that's it.
Okay, hello. I'm Rhiannon. I am a seabird ecologist that's employed by the University of Liverpool, but I'm based in the Turks and Caicos Islands at the moment, where I'm helping to run a collaborative project that we've been doing since 2022 to try and count every seabird in the Turks and Caicos Islands. It's a big collaborative project with local, regional and international organisations, and it happens to be running at the same time as we pushed for the first regional Seabird Census, so it's really well timed. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the TCIs and the background into why we care and what we're doing. So the Turks and Caicos Islands is probably one of the Caribbean countries that has one of the highest rates of coastal development and human population growth at the moment. We also have a huge diversity of mobile marine vertebrates and very rich marine ecosystems. So there's some real challenges and conflicts that we're trying to address at the moment. And amongst all of these amazing animals are seabirds. So we have 15 species of resident seabirds in the Turks and Caicos Islands, 13 of which we know are breeding, 2 of which we think are breeding, but we don't have confirmation of that yet. And it's arguably one of the most important breeding sites in the Caribbean for seabirds in terms of the diversity and the population sizes. However, despite its importance, there's actually been very little monitoring, so very little effort-based monitoring and population work done for over 20 years now. So we got a big grant from the UK government and we started a project in 2022. It's a massive effort with lots of people, lots of organisations involved. And over the last 2 years, we've been to over 40 sites in both years, all the little orange dots you can see on the map, to try and count all of the seabirds and to try and understand the health and the size and the distribution of the populations. The big yellow circles you can see are where some of the more sizable seabird populations are, further offshore and on the Turks Bank off to the right. But what we want to do is we want to gain up-to-date population assessments. We want to know what the key threats are to these populations, and we want to identify what the high priority sites are for conservation. A lot of the colonies are already nesting within sites which are offered some form of protection. So they may be sanctuaries, national parks, or nature reserves. But we want to use the information that we're trying to gain now to develop appropriate, strong site and species management plans for the future. And we're working with international organisations like BirdLife International to update existing important bird area networks. So I'm going to quickly go over some of the survey methods that we're using because we have so many different species with different breeding behaviours. So we go out to all of these really remote offshore keys and some of the more populated areas. We do boat-based counts. We undertake detailed searches on foot. We're using really cool technology like thermal drones and drones to capture imagery that we then analyse and throw into some really sophisticated models to try and automatedly detect birds in images. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But we're using a huge range of different methods to try and understand what's going on with these different populations. So when we've got very small colonies or very small geographical areas that we have to survey, we can undertake full counts and we can do really detailed searches. But when we're working over large areas with very large populations of seabirds, we have to use subsampling regimes. And the type of regime that we use will depend, again, largely on the species or the site we're in. So sometimes we use square plots or circular plots, and we'll have to then extrapolate up to a bigger area. We also use things like transects when we're working in areas with very strong environmental gradients. So in TCI, we have lots of shrub nesters, which are problematic because they're basically nesting under bushes, which makes it really difficult. They nest in cactus as well, which is really problematic for us. We have open ground nesters, which are much more simple because they're in open areas. We have cave and crevice dwellers as well, which are hard, and then arboreal nesters. So it's really varied, and our surveys and our population programs are having to be tailored to the behaviour of the birds. So I'm going to just give you a few very quick case studies or examples, some of the things that we're doing. We don't have large long-term data sets that I can show you like some of the other islands because we're starting from a huge area of data deficiency. So the first is a triple count method that we're using with species like sooty terns, which nest in very large numbers, and they nest in amongst vegetation. And so what we do is we mark out small plots because we can't feasibly go through whole massive cacti fields and count these birds. And within these smaller plots, we apply 3 different approaches. The first is that we will sit far away from the birds in a place we're not going to disturb them, and we'll do a vantage point count from a distance to see what we can see with our naked eye or with binoculars. We then walk up to the plot very slowly, and we do what we call a flush count. So this is where the flush is essentially where a bird will fly off of its nest into the air. So you can count the birds that are flying up into the air. So we'll then do a flush count, and then that's just a little video there of us doing that. And then lastly, we'll actually walk into the plot as a team. All of our team are trained to do this, and we'll basically undertake a very detailed search of all the nests, all the chicks, any unflushed adults that we then find in the plots. And then we can use these three methods and these three counts that we get, and we can compare them to see which is most appropriate or how variable our estimates would be based on the method that we apply. And these just give you a very, very quick example of two species that we're working with the three different methods. And in both cases, we're finding for these two species of seabirds, as you might expect, that our detailed searches on foot give much higher estimates. But quite often we can't do this across whole colonies because it causes higher levels of disturbance. But we can then get correction factors. So we can do a vantage point count and we can say, okay, we think for this species that we're missing 40% of the birds that are actually hunkered down under the grass if we do a vantage point count from a distance. So it allows us to apply correction factors to our data. This is another example of a data set that we're working on at the moment, a species that's very difficult to survey that we do have breeding in the Turks and Caicos Islands are the gull-billed terns. They're often overlooked because they don't nest in very large colonies. And they can be in small groups and clusters or isolated pairs over huge geographical distances. So we've been undertaking surveys last year of gull-billed terns on one of the islands called East Caicos in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And the way that we apply, we go about the surveys for this species, because we can't walk to hundreds of ponds in East Caicos, is to randomly select certain areas and ponds. We'll go and we'll survey them. And then we'll extrapolate up to all of the unsampled ponds in the whole of East Caicos to get a population estimate. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do with the resources that we have. So that's how we're going about it with this species. The next one I'm going to just really quickly mention is the Audubon shearwaters, some of my favorites. This species is unusual, or not unusual, but it's very different from some of the terns in that it's very active at night. It comes to the colony and leaves the colony during crepuscular hours, so dawn and dusk, and it's much more vocally active at night as well. So they're really, really hard. They nest in the bedrock, they nest in the rock in places that humans can't get to. So what we do is we use acoustic monitoring to survey our shearwaters, and we have been going to the areas in Turks and Caicos where we believe them to be nesting, and we've been using a method called playback. So we have a phone or a dictaphone with a vocalizing pair that we just play on a loop. And we go to our areas, to our plots within our bigger areas, we play our acoustic, our vocalizations, and then we try to see if the birds respond to us. I did have a nice vocalization of a duetting pair responding, but unfortunately it's not working. But what we'll do is we will, similarly to some of the other species I've mentioned, we'll subsample in plots. And they're much more vocally active at night. So we subsample and we play the playback during the daytime. We go to all the potential nest sites and we play our recording. And then we record the response rate of the birds during day. We then go to the same places at night, the same plots, and we do the same thing at night. And then we can get a correction factor for how many more pairs we think there are that we didn't detect during the day. Because it's quite dangerous for our team to walk around these really isolated areas at nighttime, we just do these little subsamples during the night, and then we will survey the whole area during the day, and then we can extrapolate up again to get more accurate estimates of how many birds we think might be breeding there. So it's just some of the challenges, just to give you an idea of some of the challenges that we come across in our surveys. This is some data that we have for the Audubon shearwaters. Before this project started, we knew they were probably breeding in TCI, but we didn't know in what numbers. And we've found that there's actually a very significant population of Audubon shearwaters here, which is really exciting. This is just an example of a map of one island that we surveyed, and we've surveyed multiple with this species on. And we already know estimates suggest that there's over 4,000 birds there breeding there on that one island. So we do have a notable population, which we didn't know before. So we're getting some really exciting results. And then lastly, the drone data. So drones are a really effective way of monitoring many seabird species that nest above ground in a much less invasive way than if we take a team into a colony. So we've been flying drones and capturing imagery, a lot of our colonies, and we're stitching them together to create these orthomosaics, which are basically maps, and then we can count the birds in the image. And we're developing some sophisticated AI models. We're training them at the moment. We're training them by eye, but then we develop the models to then automatically detect birds in our images, because we have thousands and thousands of images that we've collected. It's a repeatable approach. It's a data set that is on our computers forever. But I need an army of people to help me. So if anyone's out there and has some spare time, please get in touch, because it's a really, really cool thing that we're doing across multiple species and multiple sites. And this is one of our images, just to show you an example of some of the birds that we're able to survey with drones now. These are the neotropical cormorants. You can see another photo here. It's quite hard to do this by eye, but I've just shown you to give an example of how many birds are in that image. So it's really exciting stuff. And we're now extending to try and track birds as well, because it's really important to protect colonies, but we also need to understand how much connectivity there is between our different populations, not just within individual countries, but between our countries. So we've been tracking Audubon shearwaters, and it's helping us to understand how our different islands in the Turks and Caicos archipelago are linked. So it's really, really exciting new data that are flying in at the moment. But that's just a very quick tour around the project that we're doing. It's a huge effort, huge number of organizations involved. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for that update, Rhiannon. There is a question from Emma in the chat. Maybe while Farah gets ready for her presentation, you could answer that. It was, have you been able to get citizen scientists involved in your survey work in the TCI?
Yeah, we have. So we have lots of different organizations involved, but also there's lots of individuals that are interested. So we have people that come out that we train. We do need a lot of people to come out, because it's quite a lot of time on the islands. So we are trying. The issue we have is that a lot of these bigger colonies are in quite remote places. So sometimes it takes an hour to an hour and a half to get out there via boat, and it can be pretty rough on the boats as well. So not everyone wants to do it once they've done it once.
Yeah, I can understand. Well, I know that we're overrunning a bit. I think I tried to pack too much in, but there's too many interesting stories from the region already that we wanted to share. But if you're still able to stay on, Farah Makida's here to talk about the seabird surveys in Anguilla. But if you do have to leave, we are recording this, so we can share this recording afterwards, so you can catch up if you did need to as well. And any more questions for Rhiannon or any of the other speakers, please keep putting them in the chat as we go along, and they can be answering them. Thank you. Farah?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Louise, and to the Birds Caribbean team for inviting us to be a part of this webinar. And so, as Louise mentioned at the beginning of this session, the National Trust conducted a full seabird census across all of our offshore keys back in 2022, but this presentation actually focuses more on our restoration and monitoring work that we've been conducting in partnership with international and national agencies. And this is work that we've been doing over the last 10 years. Okay. There we go. Okay, so for some context, Anguilla lies at the top of the Lesser Antillean island chain, with almost all of its offshore keys lying to the north, except for Anguillita, which is off to the west. And then we have Scrub and Little Scrub Islands lying to the east. And since 2011, the National Trust has been conducting significant work on these offshore keys, which is where our nesting seabird populations are concentrated. So all of these offshore keys are key biodiversity areas, with Sombrero Island, Dog Island, Prickly Pear Keys, and Scrub Island also being important bird and biodiversity areas. But this biodiversity is at risk, and more than 60 species have been listed as globally threatened on the IUCN Red List. So apart from land degradation and conversion, and of course climate change, invasive species are one of the greatest threats to Anguilla's biodiversity. And of these invasive species, rodents, including black and brown rats and house mice, have been listed as amongst the top 100 worst invasives on the Global Invasive Species Database. And on Anguilla, rodents haven't just been limited to the mainland. They've invaded or were introduced to the offshore keys centuries ago. So in an effort to address this significant threat and to increase the resilience of our biodiversity to other stressors, including climate change, we launched our island restoration program in 2011, first focusing on Dog Island. So Dog Island is a 205-hectare privately owned island located 15 kilometers northwest of the Anguilla mainland. It's characterized by dense and very scrubby thorn bush, parts of which are almost impenetrable. And in 2011, it was considered one of the most important islands in the Lesser Antilles for seabird nesting populations. But it also provides critical habitat for terrestrial and wetland birds, lizards, sea turtles, and plants. But this biodiversity was at risk and threatened by invasive black rats. So we were able to secure international funding, and in collaboration with Fauna and Flora, the Government of Anguilla, Wildlife Management International, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, we launched our eradication program on the island in October 2011. So the program involved 5 main phases, including the cutting of tracks across the island to access the territory of every rat, with tracks totaling a distance of 42 kilometers, followed by a baiting period where bait was placed along the tracks and monitored and replenished at least daily. And then we monitored rat activity using a variety of tools, ranging from chocolate scented wax to tracking tunnels to trail cameras. And once we were confident that all of the rats were removed, we established a permanent bait station network around the perimeter of the island, which we try to monitor about every 6 weeks or so. And then the final phase was and continues to be monitoring wildlife before, during, and then after the eradication. So in terms of monitoring the impacts of the eradication on seabird numbers, what we found is that seabird nesting populations seem to have fluctuated over the years. But we do note that count totals have been affected by our ability to actually access the interior part of the island. So in 2013, directly following the eradication, when the grid lines were still very accessible, we were able to conduct our most comprehensive counts. But since then, we've been relegated to the perimeter using binoculars and spotting scopes, and then creating really narrow paths to assist with our city turn counts. So results of these assessments suggest significant declines in our brown booby and laughing gull populations, as well as our city turn population. And while the city turn population is still quite large, and despite the removal of the rodents, we are concerned about these troubling findings, and this definitely warrants further and continued monitoring. But following the successful removal of the rats on Dog, we moved on to the Prickly Pear Keys. So Prickly Pear East and West are 2 small privately owned islands. They're uninhabited, and they're approximately 8 kilometers north of Anguilla and about 5 kilometers southeast of Dog. So Prickly Pear East is the rounder but smaller of the 2 keys, with a land area of about 31 hectares, and then Prickly Pear West, meanwhile, is about 32 hectares and is longer and narrower, and the 2 keys are separated by a very narrow channel. The keys are an important bird and biodiversity area, as well as a key biodiversity area, and they hold regional important populations of seabirds and provide sanctuary to Lesser Antillean iguanas, which we reintroduced to the island beginning in 2016. So brown rats had invaded the island. They were likely introduced when the keys were used as a plantation site during the colonial period. But in 2018, again with international funding, we undertook our second major rat eradication initiative. So similar to Dog, we partnered with Fauna and Flora, Wildlife Management International, and the eradication followed a very similar 5-phase approach, beginning with the cutting of tracks across the 2 keys, and then placing temporary bait stations filled with bait along the tracks. And in addition to the bait stations, we use flavored monitoring wax to also monitor the rat take. So we launched the eradication phase of the project on the 23rd of March, 2018. And by the 19th of April, there were no further signs of rats on the islands, which was pretty much on target in terms of what we expected in timing. We thought that it would take just about a month to eradicate the rats. So our monitoring of the bait uptake showed that there appeared to be a greater density of rats on Prickly Pear West rather than Prickly Pear East. We're not exactly sure why this was the case, but it could be due to a few things. There are more seabirds on Prickly Pear West than on East. And we also undertook the eradication soon after Hurricane Irma. So the islands were just beginning to recover. And also on Prickly Pear East, there was a restaurant there, but because of Irma, it was out of commission. So we think that maybe one of the main food sources for the rats was eliminated. And so following international protocols, the Keys were officially declared rat-free in March 2020, 2 years after the last rat was recorded. And our focus since then has been on biosecurity and biodiversity monitoring. So similar to dog, we monitor bait stations that we placed around the perimeter of the islands about every 4 weeks. And fortunately, we haven't seen any rats since April 2018. But in terms of monitoring biodiversity and habitat recovery, and specifically that of seabirds, we've seen, again, fluctuations in our nesting population numbers. So we've recorded significant increase in brown booby numbers as well as in brown noddy numbers, but a decrease in the red-billed tropic birds and laughing gulls. So for red-billed tropic birds, we note that they were affected by a cat that was abandoned on Prickly Pear West in mid-2017, and that predated on at least half of the colony. And while we tried to find and remove the cat, we were unable, but then the island was impacted by Hurricane Irma, and after that, we never saw the cat again. And there was no trace of the cat after that. But Hurricane Irma also impacted the nesting habitat of the tropic birds. And these birds preferred to nest in the rocks and in the crevices, and a lot of that was flattened and displaced during the hurricane. But fortunately, we are starting to see a recovery in their numbers. And so finally, in 2021, we focused our attention on Sombrero Island, which is a remote, very flat island that lies 65 kilometers northwest of the Anguilla mainland. Its 37 hectares is primarily comprised of rocky rubble, the result of decades of highly destructive guano mining, which was conducted between the mid-1960s through to 1890. So Sombrero Island is, again, also an important bird and biodiversity area and a key biodiversity area, and currently Anguilla's only Ramsar site. So it provides habitat to regionally important nesting seabird populations and is home to the endemic ground lizard, Sombrero ground lizard, potentially endemic tree lizard, and the endemic Sombrero bee. And so these species, amongst others, were impacted by the house mouse, which was introduced to the island during the guano mining period. And so it was our target species for the eradication initiative, which we undertook from the 14th of June to the 10th of August, 2021. So with this restoration initiative, there were 4 phases. The first was establishing a bait station grid. The second was removing the mice, so the baiting period. The third was intensive monitoring of bait uptake. And then the fourth was post-eradication biosecurity and biodiversity monitoring. So in terms of results, no signs of mice were observed after just over 1 month of baiting. And through the eradication operation and our ongoing monitoring of the island since August 2021, we've been able to conclude that our eradication efforts were successful since we haven't seen any further signs of mice. And in terms of seabird recovery, it's still a bit early to say what the impact of the eradication has been. But generally, we've been seeing increases in brown and masked booby numbers, but declines in bridle, tern, and brown noddy numbers. City terns and laughing gulls have always sort of nested in small numbers, so we're not surprised by the fluctuations that we're seeing with these 2 species. We also want to note that brown booby numbers reflected here in 2013 are likely lower than the actual numbers. Both brown and masked boobies have 2 breeding cycles. The main one is in the summer, but there's also a later one around October, November. So in 2013, we were actually only able to make it out to the island during the summer. So we did miss that second cycle, which would have likely bumped up the numbers for both of those species. Now, based on the results of this monitoring, what we're seeing, unfortunately, is a general decline in seabird nesting populations and numbers, particularly for brown boobies and city terns nesting on Dog Island. So there's also been a significant decline in laughing gull numbers. And while the species doesn't tend really to be a priority and maybe an early warning sign of what's to come for other seabirds. Hopefully not, but we're just not sure at this point. So what's interesting also is that while seabird numbers haven't really increased as would be expected, especially on dog, where the eradication was conducted over 10 years ago, we have seen notable increases in terrestrial birds and reptiles. And also surprising is that the number of Audubon shearwaters hasn't increased. So we sort of seem to generally assume that burrow nesting or ground nesting seabirds will increase after an eradication, but this doesn't appear to be the case for dog. We know that there's plenty of habitat for breeding on the island, so it seems like there might be other limiting factors at play, including climate change and perhaps changes to fish stocks and food availability, and maybe even the goats that are still there, and that could be affecting nesting habitat quality. But despite these results, we are not at all suggesting that eradications aren't important or impactful. They are, and they do help increase the resilience of populations against other threats. And this has been clearly seen on Redonda and Antigua, where the transformation of the island has been really, truly incredible. But it does mean that we might need to, or we probably should be taking a more comprehensive and holistic and multi-sectoral approach to seabird conservation and marine spatial planning. That is it for my presentation. And thank you for sticking with me. I know we're over time.
Thank you so much, Farah. That was a very nice end to the talks with your recommendation to take a holistic approach, which I think all the talks are kind of leaning towards. There are two questions. Well, I think the first one, can you say why numbers are declining on Dog Island despite the eradication? You did mention some reasons for that, but we're really not sure at the moment. And the next, are the birds competing with each other, or is it the goats? How much of an impact do you think the goats are having?
The goat population, we haven't done a census probably since 2012, so we don't know what the exact numbers are, but they definitely haven't declined. They do trample through the colonies, so there could be some destruction of nests, but it is hard to tell. What we wanted to do when we first did that eradication was create exclusion zones where the goats wouldn't be able to access, but because it is privately owned, we needed permission from the landowner, and unfortunately we weren't able to secure that. But something like that would help us better understand what that potential impact could be.
Thanks, Farah. Any more questions, or I just share my screen and just finish off, and if that's okay. And put any more questions in the chat as we go along. So just to summarize, well, sorry for overrunning, but I think you'll agree they were some very interesting talks and worth hanging around for. But just a quick summary of what's happening next. So as we've mentioned at the beginning, we're still collating and collecting the data, and we know people are still surveying into 2024 just to make sure you get maximum coverage of the different breeding seasons and breeding sites. So data is still coming in, we're still collecting it, and we haven't really started to analyze this data yet until we get a bigger amount of data in. But as Ivan mentioned at the start of this, we are planning to hold a session at the Birds Caribbean conference this summer, where we'll start looking at the data and start to examine and look at ways of analyzing data collectively as a group. So that will be the start of the analysis, and then we'll continue to work together collectively with everybody who submitted the data until the end of 2024, probably the beginning of 2025, just to get all the data in and examine any trends we can, make comparisons between sites. And the ultimate plan is to publish a report highlighting the importance and distribution of seabirds across the Caribbean that will be in the Journal of Caribbean Ornithology. That's our long-term aim in the next few years. So really, it's just really important that we continue to collect the data and all start looking at it together and analyzing it. Yes, so I hope that the examples that we've seen in this presentation have highlighted how important it is for us to study and survey Caribbean seabird populations. And if you're not already collecting data and you want to, then it's not too late. Hopefully the speakers have inspired you to get out to your seabird sites if you have any, or to find out who can collect data. And if you want to do that, if you need support, we've got a range of supporting materials on our website, and we're here to help you and advise if we can. And as you can see from the attendance at this webinar, we've got a huge network here of people who survey different kinds of seabirds in different kinds of ways all over the region. So we should be drawing on this network as well to support each other. And if you want to get in contact, here's our email address here, or check out any of our resources on our website. We've got the Birds Caribbean Seabird Working Group listserv. If you're not already signed up for that, that's a useful resource as well. Yeah, I think that's all. I think Ivan might have some. Would you want to add anything to this to finish up? Or Jennifer? Or me?
No, I just want to thank you everybody for attending. It was good to see about 30 people attending and counting the panelists. Thanks a lot for the presenters. It was very interesting to see all the different aspects of censusing seabirds, from the methodology, from Rhiannon, and all the way to predator control and monitoring post eradication. So looking forward to hearing from all of you. I'm going to send an email to the listserv asking for updates about seabird work, so we can start working on the newsletter for 2024. So you should see an email coming in soon. But thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists and our hosts and to our guests. And I do hope to see most of you in the Dominican Republic this summer.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. We'll be in touch soon, and hopefully hear from you soon as well with your seabird data.